Welcome to Policy in Practice by SPRF India. I'm your host, Yugang Mishra, and joining us on the ever-crucial question of Indian industrialization, we have with us Dr. Virmani. Summarizing the body of work of a person who has spent almost half a century in public policy is a pretty daunting task, but for the benefit of our viewers, I'll attempt so. Currently a full-time member of Niti Aayog, Dr. Virmani has been the Chief Economic Advisor in a very interesting period from 2007 to 2009, has been in the senior-most positions in organizations such as IMF, the World Bank, various iterations of the Indian Planning Commission, RBI's Committee on Monetary Policy, LIC, Punjab National Bank, SEBI, Allahabad Bank, amongst others. He has been associated with the Brookings Institution, Center for Policy Research, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, and has founded organizations like EGROW and Chintan. And I'm pretty sure when I'm doing this, I'm still leaving out a handful of the positions and your roles, sir. He has a vast scholarship under his penmanship, and some of his most iconic books are Accelerating Growth and Poverty Reduction from 2004, almost seminal book like that. Propelling India from socialist stagnation to global power in 2006, and one of the first persons I feel who talked about the multipolar world in 2009, from unipolar to tripolar world. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
To begin with, allow me, sir, to open today with gauging your views on something on which the dust has somewhat settled, at least for a brief 90-day period that we have been graced with. The new US administration and the signs of a changing global order, and specifically with regards to the Indian manufacturing sector. To be a little more specific, should the manufacturing sector still be a certain engine of growth of Indian economy? And if so, then do we have to realign our goals with it or rethink them? What do you think, sir?
I would look at that question in two parts, I guess. One is, of course, the international situation, which everybody is trying to understand, but I have my perspective. And the second is what is going on in India and how it relates to that. So that's useful to do it in two parts. So firstly, what about the international situation? So in 2018, the current president, in his first term, president of the US, introduced in 2017 a national security NSS new policy, which gave a lot of focus which changed the focus away from the West and Atlantic to the Pacific.
Right.
And secondly, in 4 steps, over kind of 4 quarters, every quarter he announced a new tariff on China.
Right.
At the end of 2018, in December actually, I was giving a talk at VFS. In fact, they called me for my views on what is happening.
Right, into 2018.
In 2018, yes. Right. After these 4 shocks.
Right.
And what I said then, and which I perfected, over the next 3 months or so, was that the world was heading towards partial economic decoupling.
Right.
Those are the words I coined then. And but part of that would be almost complete high-tech decoupling.
Right.
So why is that important? Because it was set in motion at that time.
Right.
And I see what has happened since then, whether under the Biden administration or under the current Trump administration, is a continuation of that.
Right.
So one is this happening, depending on how deeply you want to go into it.
Right.
We can discuss this further. But the implications for India, I also started drawing at the same time.
Right.
So my interest in the US is not for the US itself, but the implication it has for the world and for India. So, it was clear to me, and of course, just a little background, because you mentioned bipolar world. I was a member of the Subramaniam Committee, which gave its report on 2006, which was main purpose was to look a network approach to India's foreign policy.
Right.
And one of the main items we were able to cover in the short time we were there was India's policy to the US. So in some sense, now whether or not how much the governments of various days after that had incorporated it, I was very clear on my policy. So coming back to India, it was clear that that if you looked at the economic development of East Asia, South Asia, all those countries which have gone from being less developed to middle income to high income, they all had some connection or economic association with the US.
Right.
And we had missed out on that
Right.
because of our socialist approach, various approaches. We need not exhume those. But the point was clear to the committee, to me, to Mr. Subramaniam, that if we were to grow fast and catch up, because of these matters we had fallen behind, Southeast Asia, East Asia, China, we had to have deeper economic and strategic relations with the US. So when this shock occurred, I saw it, I mean, one of these, so there were two views, right? One is that people were thinking that we don't want to choose. We want to be, I mean, globally now. It was clear to me that people would have to choose. Okay? And now it is becoming clear to everybody in the second Trump term. So I started thinking about how it was that we could, utilize, look at it not just as a threat, but look at it as a challenge to use the opportunity to make India grow fast, whether it was in economic terms or strategic terms.
Right.
So within that context, we get to manufacturing, right? So we've had over the years, we've always gone back and forth on manufacturing, you know, where even in the socialist period and so on. Now, the difficulty was in the 1990s reforms in which I was involved in deeply in many aspects of it. We recognize that when you remove tariffs, there's actually a tendency for the services to grow faster than manufacturing.
Very interestingly, it's almost called
so that's basic kind of economics in a way. Kind of conventional economics, let me say. Again, I won't go into the details. And therefore, after that, there were many attempts, many committees at different levels. There was a secretary level committee, there was a Krishnamurthy committee, etc. So this problem has always been there. But the second element of this was structural, which was we also knew that in history, part of the growth comes from a shift of labor from agriculture to manufacturing.
True.
And again, we had missed that area. So there's missing the opportunities which Southeast Asia had utilized, missing this structural change, etc. Our thinking, at least my thinking, has always been, how can we now, given all these changes, go back and utilize this thing to shift labor into manufacturing. So manufacturing, the question was, what are the tools? That has been the problem. How to do it in a way which is not protectionist in the sense that you build an inefficient industry. So the struggle has always been, and it is again, since 2014 with this government, has been, you've heard the various words, Atmanirbhar, etc., etc. And really the question, it's like an intellectual struggle or an economic struggle to see how to build an efficient manufacturing sector. Okay. So that's the broad picture. So manufacturing remains important. Now people are realizing how important it is for defense, for many other things. Right? But the economic context is what I just told you.
Because even the defense part is now an economic...
so now it's all related. It's now all of government or all of country approach.
So to sort of move from here to the next part, the structural transformation you feel is an important aspect still on the agenda. Not in the same way in which perhaps we have the classical sort of Lewisian sense, or then an export sort of led growth is still on the agenda. If one were to, and since you mentioned also the 91 reforms in which you were significantly involved in, and even later you have been involved in, but based on your experience, how would you characterize the period from 91, again, whose thrust sector was the industrial reforms, and the next part, which happens for me, at least since the 2011 National Manufacturing Policy, and then a series of reforms which come under the Prime Ministership of Mr. Narendra Modi. do you see as continuity or there are differences?
So, there are always differences, because what you had built up in the 70s was a heavily controlled sector. And this is something which I disagree with many prominent economists who you heard the name. In fact, the reforms actually, in my view, started in 80, not in 91. And this is a position which I have held against all the other prominent economic commentators.
Panagaria.
Exactly.
Right.
You can mention the names. I don't like to mention the names.
Right.
So I disagree with them completely.
Right.
So why is that? Because it was like a pressure cooker, right? It was like you had suppressed all the private initiatives. So when you just took a little lid off, that pressure produced a huge, I'm giving an evocative image. Of course, I have papers to show this. So what happened was that the growth actually accelerated by 3 times. So the per capita GDP growth before that for the previous 30 years was roughly 1.3% per annum. And it blew up to 3.7% or thereabouts. It's a 3 times thing. It's huge. And for anybody to say that there were no reforms, I just don't understand how they can do it. Of course, there were reforms. There were also negative moments. So again, we can go into details, but that will take us far apart. So in that sense, the reforms are continuity, but every reform is different. Some reforms have taken place. The new ones will have to be different. The situation is now different. You've done certain easy part by letting off the lid. In fact, what my research showed was that the key driver of productivity for that reforms was capital goods, the liberalization. In the socialist period, we were forced to buy on rupee payments from the Soviet Union. Those capital goods were completely inefficient. Okay, so the manufacturing, even when they invested, they were not efficient. So when we blew that lid off, they had a huge surge of investment, which took the productivity, skyrocketed.
Right.
So everything is different. So obviously, once you've done that, that is not an option, right? And therefore, in the 91, the focus was on, as you correctly pointed out, mostly the manufacturing sector, right? So you had to liberalize everything. You can't do one thing and then leave. For example, liberalizing imports and exports without doing the financial sector. How will they get the money to invest, etc.? So we did a round of reform which covered all aspects, or as many aspects as were relevant together. So then we move to the next stage. You start looking at other things, factor markets which have not been covered, other service sectors, products. So clearly, since 2014 is different. Of course, I should also mention the Vajpayee government, which started moving a lot on the infrastructure. Not just public investment, but PPP, etc. So liberalizing whatever aspects of infrastructure, which telecom. I was involved in the telecom reforms. So there were infrastructure, and then in 2014, everything else which is left, all the factor markets, labor, land, etc. At least there has been an recognition is first thing, right? Second thing is to formulate something. Third thing is to implement it. But as we know, as you know better than me, you also have to kind of create the atmosphere in which these things are actually implemented and go through. Partly because it's a federal structure, right? There are only so many. So basically, in that sense, most things which are on the union government list were easier to do and have been done. Where you get to the concurrent list and the state list, obviously, state list you cannot do. The states have to do. And even in the concurrent list, for example, labor or education, it's partly at the end of it a matter of persuading the states to do what we feel may be in their interest.
So I'll pick some of the points that you're making for the later point in our discussion, because those are very important. You're saying that the situations have changed. Of course, the reforms of 91 did play a part, but it also played a part in changing the situation. and the 2014 sort of regime of industrial policy has worked with what we had.
Yeah.
In terms of where we stand today,
Sorry, I shouldn't mention specific. I gave you the general perspective, but for example, the small scale industry liberalization had more or less happened by 2014, right?
Right.
The part
De-reservation,
right. So the parts I said which was left had to be done, right?
Right.
So one of the difficult one is the formal informal sector.
True.
The completion of the FDI reforms.
True.
Because there is a last mile problem here. Because when you're talking about foreigners, there's a threshold, and there is also what do you call it? Momentum effect. You know,
Right.
you may have changed it. Actually, for example, I used to say, I mean, I say now also, our FDI policy is much more liberal than all these South Asian countries, and this is a fact. There's an index,
Right.
and yet foreign companies don't know that.
Right.
So
Right.
that perception lag is also an issue.
True.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember that you were in that one very crucial period in 2007 to 9 when there was a distinct boom of investment that we saw, which some commentators have also called the dream run. And there was this, again, because the reforms have been a continuous affair since 91. So
Right.
one can also place it over there, what you're talking about, of the perception
till
effect.
2008, then there
Right.
was the crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, pegging you back to that point where
Yeah.
we acknowledge that there are the grounds have changed almost.
Right.
What do you think in terms of where we are placed internally and externally, our own productive capacities, the world outlook, and also the trade scenario?
Right. So what is the new conceptually new? There is a completely new conceptually actually,
Right.
and that has to do with the understanding that one of the key things we missed out on, which China and Southeast Asia took advantage of, was this movement of supply chains.
Right.
And that depends critically on an anchor investor,
Right.
which is again linked to FDI.
Right.
You know, we've thought of FDI in the earlier years, and I'm talking we, I mean, I have personally thought like that also. So it's not a question of criticism.
Right.
But we thought of FDI, by FDI hai kahin na kahin aa jayegi. We didn't link it to the supply chains. Okay.
Right.
And the critical new learning, if I may call it that, I mean, obviously one had it somewhere in the background, but it was never translated into policy thinking.
Right.
So the linkage of these anchor investors has been the key in Southeast Asia growth. So you saw, I then remembered once I started thinking that I still remember that, I forget exactly, like the 80s or something, there was a disc manufacturer. Sundisk or something, which was the first company to set up in Malaysia.
Right.
But you know, it's not just arbitrary FDI. They then set up the whole supply chain gradually.
Right.
So that was the key missing element in some sense in our thinking, even of FDI, which also was gradually liberalized. It wasn't all at once.
Right.
So the big new change is understanding that you have to get these anchor investors, and you have to make sure they are there. They don't just come for the heck of it, because they have a whole supply chain behind them.
Right.
They can't do that.
Right.
It is not just an isolated investment.
Right.
They have to ensure that the supply chain keeps functioning.
Safeguarded. Yep.
So some of that they'll have to move here. Some of that you have to allow completely free imports. So this complex of policies which are necessary to get these supply chains and facilitate, because just getting them is not enough unless they build it up.
Right.
Okay. So they may start with, let's say, 100,000 mobile phones, but they don't become efficient until they're producing 1 million.
Right.
So you got to make sure they get up to that, otherwise you
Scale.
don't get full benefits.
Right. Well, I mean, in all sort of with the benefit of doubt, the concept of global supply chain started appearing in the 90s also. Like, and I truly believe that until and unless there is theory of it, one has not truly understood it. But still, it was very nascent.
Yeah, the literature had it, but what I am talking about, connecting it to growth theory,
Right.
and connecting it to policy is what we didn't make. You know, as somebody who reads theories, all these things are there. But unless you connect it into your model of growth and how it links to policy, there is no effect. No?
Right.
It's academics. You can discuss it in things. That's not what I do.
Right.
What I try to do is solve problems by bringing the theory and the empiric to say, okay, what do we have to actually do?
Right. So depending on the fact that contingent on all of these considerations, even our own strengths, opportunities that we have internally and again externally, what do you think are some of our sunrise sectors, again to take back that old term?
So how does one see one is always looking for sunrise sector, but you have to remember, by definition, these are very risky and uncertain. Right? Because if they were not, they would soon be normal sectors.
True.
It's kind of like two sides of the same coin. So the issue for an economist becomes, how do we, again, there is a risk involved which is real. Okay, it is not imaginary.
Right.
So what the government can do is, again, it relates to what I said. The issue is, what is it the government should do?
Right.
Just saying sunrise centers, it is just, okay, sunrise sector, so what? I mean, right? So what is the role of government is what the challenge for me is then, right? So given the uncertainty, the government can do two things. One is become a partner in uncertainty, so the risk appetite goes up.
Right.
Okay. And the second is to fund some kind of an R&D which gives you more knowledge, which reduces the risk.
Right.
Okay. So let's say we have three sectors. Let's say green hydrogen. Just pick any sectors. They are all uncertain. There's no certainty about it, right? So just to say, people who are working in green hydrogen will tell you, this is the future. Somebody who's working in small modular will say, yeah, but as an economist, I cannot take, I have to, there are 6 people before me. Why should I, on what basis do I decide you or he is the thing, right?
True.
So the general approach to risk is you diversify, right? So you say, okay, we will put 10 million or whatever crores in this hydrogen, SMR, etc. So that's one thing, right? So government becomes a kind of partner, which allows the actual researchers to then do some research and come back to whoever is judging, right? So it may turn out, the hydrogen guy was right. He is progressing very fast. Then you shift resources. So that is one approach. The second is you do research. You actually, whether it's in a government laboratory or a private, you actually fund the research, right? To say that, okay, you clarify, because that will help us make future decisions, right? So in that sense, the thing, EV, green technology is a big thing, we know. But there are many green things. For example, more efficient housing. Is anybody working on that? So you say, okay, if nobody is doing it, maybe government should fund thinking on or development of new materials. Like we live in a hot country, so we have to think of ourselves. So can we have building materials on the roof or whatever that go into every house? So automatically the need for air conditioning goes down. Things like that, right? In food, whether and that this government is doing. Prime Minister has been very clear about this holistic approach to things. So the millets issue, right? It is more efficient than meat and so on. So changing lifestyle, changing all kinds of things, right? So that is, to me, a sunrise sector is anything which is risky. I mean, otherwise, it'll happen. I don't need to worry about it, right? So it's a question of what is it that we need to do.
And you're right that there is distinctly a tendency, even in the last budget announcements, there is distinctly a tendency to sort of, as you said, be there to sort of support the risk.
To help reduce the risk.
So, but I'll also, I'm very curious also to gauge your opinion on this, because this is something that I've followed in your latest presentations also. The question of labor-intensive sectors in India has, at least in my knowledge, in my readings, since the 10th Planning Commission report has not gone out of focus. We are still very much intent, again, with regards to all that we have been talking about. It's also there on the agenda of the BTA with America. What do you think where we are with our labor-intensive manufacturing?
So let me start with all the conventional solutions which one has been talking about from, for the past so many decades. And then see, is there anything new way of looking at it, right? So the structural transformation which I mentioned
Right.
was one part of it, right? So why is it that agricultural labor not moving to manufacturing?
Right.
That issue has been there, labor laws, etc., was that SSI reservation, which we gradually removed, and so on, right? Land has become a big problem. In most countries of the world, manufacturing happens in urban areas. In India, it's been happening in what are defined as rural areas. Okay, that's another problem which has to be addressed. Either you build industrial townships there because land is too costly in urban areas now, right? So you've got to address the land issue if you want industrialization, right? Electricity. We meaning the state. This is what I call this. You remember I said state subject.
Right.
It's a purely distribution is a pure state subject. They define the prices, and prices from a long time have been biased against industry. So the charges for industry are much higher than what we call the marginal cost or the full cost, and they are used to subsidize residential.
Right.
So what you get is I have to pay less for electricity, but then you get less industry. You get less jobs. Right. So there are these conventional things which are still an issue and which we are still struggling with. In the budget also there is stuff because the states have to be persuaded. Right. Then the key new issue in a way, and then there's the question of formal informal. There are two. At least in my way of thinking, which I'm thinking in a slightly different way than I used to, let's say 10 years ago, the formal informal breakdown, the export. So we've always said that most Southeast Asian countries, they had labor intensive. Why are we not doing it? What is the problem? So there are a whole bunch of policies, which some of them again in the budget mention MSMEs. But conceptually, it is linked to two new things which I'm emphasizing now, which I learned in a way over the last, let's say, 2-3 years, some of them after coming here. One is the question of quality chains. Okay, when we think of formal and informal, we are just thinking in a administrative way. But what underlies it? What I realized was they are completely different quality chains. So you got a whole chain there, you got to share, they don't mix. Okay, so how to cross this barrier? And secondly, it's linked to skills. So when the employment issue is not employment, it is skilling in my view now. My latest view is we've just got completely sidetracked. It is about skills. If you have skills, you'll have a job. Okay. So in an extreme form, I give the example of an NGO. It's obviously extreme to make a point, right? So I give the example of an NGO which found that there are 11 different categories of work on education related below the teacher level. Right? You think of a school teacher in a rural area. They found there are 11 categories of education. They defined the curriculum. They trained the people. Of course, small NGO, 100 or so many people, how many, and they placed every single one of them. Conclusion: the skills generated the job. There is no job without the skill. Okay. Now, I admittedly say that's an extreme view. There are also jobs where they cannot find enough skilled people. Okay. So, in my view, it is so much more about the right type of skilling, how it is related to education. Now, I must say that NEP, in a sense, recognized it. Okay. It is there in all the words. But like I am admitting, I did not really realize it till very recently, let's say 2 years ago, how deeply important that is. So skilling has become now a kind of almost a passion for me. How can I make sure, how can I mean, contribute? I am not anybody as an academic or a, advisor. So skilling and then the quality chains. So I mentioned that we ignored the supply chain, the FDI link, that supply chain is also about quality chain. So that's another deeper recognition. Again, theoretically one can read something, but you don't understand. I understood this when I visited a mobile factory. Okay, it's a completely different quality chain. Let me give you an example. Where's my phone? This thing in the back, which you see this thing is
The
made
strip.
of aluminium.
Right.
You would think there's a strip.
Right.
Actually, it starts with a whole block of aluminium.
And then it's cut.
Complete block.
Right.
There's no space here.
Right.
Okay? And that aluminium has to be a very specific quality, otherwise you'll never get to this smooth, fine piece that you see here.
True.
So people who don't know will say, ye to aluminium hai, isko tariff laga do. No, that thing the whole phone cannot be made unless you have that exact thing.
Right.
Because it's a block which is converted into this fine thing.
Right.
It has little indentations inside where all the things fit.
Right.
You don't realize it.
Right.
Okay? So there is a quality chain. I mean, aluminium of a specific quality, baki to chhodiye.
Not just.
I mean, you would
not
think
the cutting.
aluminium, what the heck, anybody who makes aluminium can make it. No, they cannot. It has to be imported.
Right.
So there is a quality, every stage it is like that.
Right.
So if you want to be an exporter of mobiles, you have to build that whole quality or allow free imports.
Right. Right.
Otherwise you will not have this phone.
Right.
That realization, I knew kind of vaguely, etc. So what is the implication? Implication is that when we talk about food processing, why are we not? We are the largest agricultural manufacturer. It's a quality chain.
Right.
It is not just one element of it like cold storage.
Right.
You have to change the whole stuff.
Right.
Right from the farm up to the part where it goes abroad.
Packaging. Right.
Everything.
Right.
And in everything, skills are involved.
Important.
So skilling, it all connects back to skilling.
Right.
The capital you can buy.
Right.
Okay, but the skills have to be created.
Right. Right. Very interesting point. I've had a bit of an experience with the garment industry. What you talk about the formal, informal, it's very interesting that you put it like that because skill is not considered what you said, that skill creates its own demand. That's a very important point I feel today. Also in view of some of the facts that you've been saying in some of your presentations. So for example, that casualization of the workforce is not a push factor, but a pull factor. Because there's a distinct high growth of real wages. So if I put that at one point of time, and the other, I feel extremely unorthodox position that you're taking, that skilling will create its own demand, supply will create its own demand, and there's a quality issue at stake. I remember this anecdote from some of the factories I was in the formal and the big export-oriented units. The quality check does not happen at the end of the production process, but at each stage of the production process, there's a specific person who does the quality check. So I would, to come back to the same question of labor-intensive manufacturing,
Right.
would it be safe to say that one of the reasons, and again, there are a host of reasons, but one of the reasons may be an inadequate supply of the labor market that we have?
Absolutely, very good question. So, one of the questions I ask them when I go into various manufacturing units is, do you get enough supply of factory labor, workers, right? And I do the same thing when I go to ITIs, etc.
Right.
So, the interesting thing there is, this problem seems to apply to males but not to females.
Right.
So the big change which I am seeing now is the people who are manufacturers have to produce, right? They don't earn profit.
Right.
So they realized it before, people like me sitting in this office, was that female labor, if you can get it, that is much better for factory jobs, for assembly, basically.
Right.
Because that is where the large number of jobs are.
Right.
So that's exactly what is happening.
Right.
Okay, but that involves two things which I would like to convey, which are very important for states to understand. So the states which have already done this are the ones where manufacturing employment for women is increasing very fast.
Right.
And that is to do with the complex of transport and housing.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So you have to, the state has to make sure or allow or not have restrictions.
Right.
For example, for a manufacturing large company, or the kind of people we talked about here, to set up housing.
Right.
Okay.
There's a lot of restrictions.
They should not say, you're doing something wrong or something, right? Because they have to do it.
Right.
They need, if they are going to get women. I mean, I was amazed at one factory, I won't put name individual factories or companies. I was asking them, I want to talk to some labor because they were girls and women. So we kind of stopped because the clean room, I couldn't, they said we better stay out of.
Right.
So on the road, this is a factory. We stopped, there were two girls walking. So I asked one of them, where are you from?
Right.
She was from Assam.
Right.
She was in the south.
Right.
So what, right? They have to have housing.
Right.
Right? If you're going to build a factory with 1,000 women working on the shop floor, you have to have
Housing.
provision for housing. And you cannot have restrictions which say, oh, industries cannot build housing.
Right.
Because how? They'll have to.
Right.
The other is transport. So if you are in an area where there are a lot of villages with women who want to work, you have to provide transport.
Right.
So you got to make it easy.
Right.
You cannot be suspicious of everything.
Right.
You know, we are in our system, anything different that somebody does, it must be some hera-pheri. So you have to recognize these two things are critical.
Right. And we also have these examples from Tamil Nadu. We have it from Haryana, I think, to a certain extent. One crucial thing also I noticed lately, and since we are talking on the states, and for example, in Uttar Pradesh's industrial policy of 2022, there's a very interesting provision of an employment booster that they give if in the mega sort of units, if you have 75% of the female workforce. I feel that we are catching up almost to it, but then again, it's not a general level. It's not a It's not a general thing.
The big companies who are aware of international practice, who are aware of how good this can be for them,
Right.
in the medium term. Obviously, initially when you do it, it costs more money.
Right.
The government should also recognize that,
Right.
huh? And not think that everybody can just go and do it. It costs more money.
Right.
And especially if you're trying to be internationally competitive, you have to give them a little leeway, right?
Right.
Because the important thing is to become competitive. Then only you will produce 100, 1 million, 2 million, you can expand. Then
Right.
you should be
Right.
investing some more money in these sort of things. But of course, now we have the, what do you call them, the social funds. What's the term? Every company has to spend CSR,
Right.
right? So it makes it a little easier. But then your CSR rules must allow it, no?
Right. Right.
So CSR could say, okay, if you provide free transport to women,
Right.
you can use or something, right? As
Right.
CSR
Right.
funds, or if you build some housing or something, right?
Right.
So you should be, the point, the reason why I'm emphasizing this is people have to know. I mean, they're not inherently bad, right? The
Right.
state governments, etc.
Right.
But you have to be aware this is a great opportunity.
Right. Right. And I think also
and it is important to be liberal at this stage.
Right.
You will get huge results.
Right. So it's very interesting. I was going to ask you at one point of time this question, and it has very naturally segued over there. You mentioned that, and it's interesting that we also come to this from since we are discussing the labor-intensive manufacturing sectors. I can distinctly sense that in the midterm, if we want to boost labor-intensive manufacturing, one of the crucial areas will be labor reforms, or a new sort of innovative thinking in terms of how we utilize labor. I've been asking this to some people now already. I've noticed that we already had labor codes on the agenda since '94, if one actually goes and thinks about it. And this was coming from there was a consensus across all the spectrums of Indian economy, all the schools of thought, that we need labor reforms, labor codes, and there was a codification exercise that was also done. And there's a huge debate about it, and undeniably so, there must be. In your academic sort of understanding, sir, since '94 till now, we have not been able to very easily go through with the reforms.
So let me give you what the position is. When I was appointed member, one of the first things I did was two things. One was to take a review of the labor codes there on. So the 4 labor codes have been passed by Parliament.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
They have not. So as part of that, what has happened since then is all the states have been making rules on it.
Right.
So when I took the review, and then a subsequent economic survey actually gave that whole review. I didn't know. This was independent thinking.
Right.
They did the review also.
Right.
I had done it here when I came. And what that showed, if I remember correctly, that so we have 28 states. So something like 24 states had made rules
Right.
on all those 4 codes.
Right.
Okay. For all names, matlab some had in one core, I mean, in one case 24, not the same ones.
Right. Right.
But roughly 23, 24.
Right.
So there were like 3 or 4 in each
Right.
code which
Right.
were missing. That is one issue which is was on the table when I came. I joined 2 and something years ago, 2 years roughly. Clearly the union government has been urging all of them to make the rules
right.
so that the thing can become effective all over. And the second is that there were some differences between the rules made by different states.
Right.
So I think some attempt has been there to make them a little more uniform by them discussing. It is not for us to impose, but if they discuss among themselves why X state is doing this or Z state doing things, maybe they can come to a compromise, right?
Right.
And have more or less the same rules, which would benefit everybody, not the business. So I think the stuff is still on.
Right.
Things keep changing, so you always have to persuade. I mean, we are in 25, but that is a political effort which I don't have really anything to contribute, right? I'm not an expert on how to persuade or politics. So that I think effort is going on to get all the states to, and to convince them. And with all this new development, maybe one of these days it will happen.
Well, it is definitely on the agenda. Sir, concludingly, since we don't have much of your time also, you were one of the early few scholars who had posited 2040 as the benchmark for when India would emerge in a certain sense. Again, with the Viksit Bharat mission and also the high income sort of aim that we have, I also wanted to gauge how far, and this is something that you were doing, I feel, before 2010s. How far or near are we, with the caveat, sir, that this is also called as a ticking sort of clock, because this is when some estimates peg it that we would have exhausted our demographic dividend. Where are we with regards to the future?
So just a few general points. One is, I first made these forecasts in the early 2000s.
Right.
And I think my first paper which I put out, I forget, I think it may have been in Nuclear at that time.
Right.
Where I made these projections. And I made these projections every 2 or 3 years when I give a talk, new talk. I update them with the new data because, World Bank, IMF, they keep changing the data. So I use the latest data. So that's one. The second thing is my whole contribution to, in a sense, foreign policy or strategy was that the thinking that it's built on a base of the economy.
Right.
So I think of it as a pyramid, right? Where the base has to be the economy, has to be broader.
Right.
If you have a cylinder, it can be toppled over. If you have an inverse, this thing will easily topple. So if you focus only on the top heavy, it won't be lasting. So that is where the most of my forecast I gave, because it's quicker and easier, the economics, but related to that is also military, because where do you get military thing? You have a budget, right? And that depends on your revenues, it depends on your economy. So it's all a pyramid. So what was that initial paper? I kind of remember 4 and 5. In 2004, I only made forecast till 2035. And then I realized that, so that showed very early, which again, this is one thing I feel bad about, nobody has recognized. I actually tried to publish that paper. There was an assistant editor in Foreign Affairs who liked it, but his editor refused it. But if that paper had been published, it would have been a landmark referred to by others, but it was never published. Anyway, in that I predicted a bipolar world. That means China would become a great power, by around, I forget exact date now, by 2035 it would start becoming. Actually,
Yeah.
because the data, it was only till 2035. And then I said, where the heck is India? It was not. So then I extended the forecast to 2050, and that's when India comes up. Right? So all the subsequent projections are more or less consistent with that.
Right.
Basically, my latest projections, so I developed an index, of economic power and military power and all that. And I use that to define, actually. Of course, I have to translate into terms which people understand when I'm giving a talk on economy.
Right.
But I'm now talking about the power part of it, the economic power, if that's what your question is. So in those projections, by 2050, we virtually catch up with China, depending on, and it's not a very hard task. In my projections, I use 6% GDP growth. So little bit, let's say 6 to 6.3 average growth over the next 25 years, we will have caught up by China in 2050 on the economic power, not the military. Military will take much longer. What that means is if that projection is correct, it will be a tripolar world. This is what I've been saying since 2005. Okay, because the next level will be way behind. That's the impact of that forecast. So it will be US, China, India. And the next one, which may be Russia or Japan or whoever, will be way below. So that is why you get tripolarity.
It's almost achievable.
In my view, it is achievable. Of course, at some other time we can discuss in detail how this comes about.
So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your time.